Hey YouTube, how's it going? What I wanted to talk about today probably won't come as much of a surprise to any of the socialist subscribers that I have. In fact, to us it kind of feels like part of being a human being and common sense. But sadly, it's clearly not common sense to a lot of people that comment on my videos, so I thought I'd make this point. I'm thinking mainly of my video in which I called for subsidised childcare for working class mothers and indeed single fathers who can't return to work because they're actually better off on welfare than working part-time because they can't afford the childcare expenses. And I'm saying we should free the very poorest people in society to be able to support their own families. And an overwhelming response is, why should I have to pay for their children? It's like, to me, like a bit of a mind-boggling perspective, but I suppose I can understand where you're coming from. I don't plan to ever have children, so technically I fall into the category that you do. I would also be supporting children without ever seeing any gain from this legislature. So I do kind of see where you're coming from, but ultimately I have to point out to you that it does directly impact your life, how these children are raised. I mean, it just seems quite crazy to me that people would be willing to let children... Firstly, okay, let's start there with the human element. It's absolutely crazy that people would let children grow up in poverty because of some kind of inherent bigotry against single mothers and poor people generally. Like, people choose to become poor, and most mothers want nothing more than to sit on welfare and have someone else pay for their childcare expenses. That's fucking ludicrous from the off. But I mean, you don't even need to apply empathy to understand where I'm coming from, just logic. You know, you live in a society with these people. In 17 years' time, when these kids that grew up on Dulles Valley Council estate, without any money and feeling impoverished and feeling disenfranchised, and without a mother who was able to take the time to educate herself, or a father who was able to return to work and support them, and without all those extra life experiences that you get, like, I don't know, getting to go to the zoo when you're a kid. You know, my ex was from a very, very impoverished background. He'd never learnt to ride a bike. He couldn't swim. He'd never been to museums as a child, or he'd never been to a theatre. He'd never had any access to any kind of any of the cultural tools that you would need were you ever to get lucky enough to get a job, that you might find yourself in the middle class, to actually pass there culturally and hold on to the respect of other people. I mean, less than that, it's your Mercedes parked to the street that they're joyriding. If they're not raised properly. It's your money that will go to pay for the prisons that they will end up in. It's your money that will pay for the medical expenses, well, if you live in Britain, it's your money that will pay for the medical expenses for the people that those children go on to beat the shit out of on a Friday night when they're drunk in front of the pub. It is in your best interests, both as a taxpayer and as a member of a society, that children get the best start they possibly can in life. And it's just crazy to me. I mean, also as a British person, I think it's a lot more the American view. Is I'm just going to push you back a bit so I can roll on the table. Roll my cigarette on the table. Rolling on the table, that would probably make for a more interesting video at this point, right? I think it's mainly Americans, because in Britain it's already an accepted premise, pretty much, because we have a national healthcare system, which means that, it makes perfect sense to anyone born of my generation that some of your money will go to help people who are in dire medical need. And this is seen as a good thing in British culture. Whereas in America, there's this kind of view that, there's a weakness and you should be ashamed, basically, if you ever find yourself poor and in need of help, or if you can't afford health insurance, then fuck you because you're too poor. Who gives a shit about poor people? Who gives a shit about members of your society? And look where it's got your societies. When I was in Portland, Oregon, recently, I saw more homeless people there than I ever saw in London. When I needed to go to a doctor, I couldn't actually afford it for several months. And when I needed help, it was from a local for food, because I was really going to starve to death because there weren't benefits. It was It took so long for a food card from the government to come through that I was living off of religious organisations' charity. So clearly this isn't something that comes naturally to the Americans, which is pretty amazing considering that 85% of your country is Christian and Jesus was a communist. I'll let that seep in a little. So basically the point I wanted to make is that it really is in your personal interests to help groups of society that are disenfranchised and to send some of your tax money towards people like that, because it will directly come back and affect you. It is the world that your children are going to have to live in. Those are the adults of tomorrow that your children will have to share a society with. It really does make sense for us all to help the most impoverished members of our society with our tax money when we can afford to do so. Right, so that's kind of that point. Well, I've only gone on for 4.5 minutes, so if there's anyone still watching, I'd like to make another point. We need to be doing away with, as a feminist, I make another point, we need to do away with marriage titles. It's bullshit. I don't like the implication that, you know, and you may say that, you know, you'd be squire until you were, you know, married, but that's bullshit. Because you know, an 8-year-old boy nowadays is not referred to as somebody Esquire. They're referred to as Mr. Whoever, Mr. John Lucas. Whereas I will be Miss until I get married, and then I may become a Ms. if I ever become divorced. Well, I personally put Ms. on everything, and I would like to encourage any female viewer that thinks about this kind of thing, the symbolism of language, to also identify themselves as a Ms. In general, in life, because it can only be used to it can only be used to put what's the phrase I'm looking for? It can only be used to encourage prejudice against unmarried women, against lesbians, and it encourages a disrespect of misses, of MISS's. And men do not have to identify like that. You know, when you apply for a job, you don't, you know, you put Mr. Whoever. They don't know whether or not you're married. They don't know whether or not you're going to have kids. They don't know anything about your marital status. And importantly, it doesn't make any fucking difference what your marital status is as a man. You can be just as respected as a bachelor in your 50s as you can be as a married man. It doesn't seem to make a difference to how people view you. And there's absolutely no reason why women should be subjected to a double standard and should have to identify by their marital status in their title, if not to discriminate against unmarried women, frankly. And so I encourage all women to do away with titles and for us all to become Mrs. And I think the only people that would really have a problem with this are married women, and I think that there's something really sad about that you actually take some kind of self-worth from the fact that you're married to a man. I find that a little bit sad, that you're proud to have lost your title, as an individual, and to have lost your family ties, you know. And I'd also like to encourage women who think about this kind of thing to give their children even if they're married to men, to give their children their surnames, particularly their daughters their surnames, because I can't trace my matrilineage, because I've been politically separated from my foremothers. I can never know who those nameless, faceless women were that toiled and slaved away in kitchens and looking after 12 children because there was no contraception. I never know who my foremothers were. I can only ever trace my matrilineage. I can find out who my great-great-great-great-grandfather is. And I think that every woman should make a political statement of starting now a tradition in their families that the lineage is actually traced through the women. It makes more sense. You carry that child for 9 months. It is you that goes through the pain of producing the child, and then it's more than likely going to be you that goes through the pain of raising the child. I really think it should be you that has your name marked on that child. And what makes me really, really want to puke all over myself is when I hear Mrs. John Smith. So you don't even have your first name anymore. You're just wife of John Smith. And it makes me so... I honestly kind of choked up a little bit in a graveyard the other day, walking around and seeing how many Mrs. John Smiths there were. And no one will ever know now what their names were. those women that were individuals that were an equal part of bringing the human race to where it is today will never be recognised. They will always just be Mrs. John Smith. Makes me very sad. So anyway, I'd like to make an argument for basically all women, regardless of age or marital status, identifying as Ms. In support of every other type of woman in society. You know, the married women supporting single women by saying, you know, well, I don't think being married makes me more socially acceptable or important or respectable, and so I don't need to identify by that title. Yeah, and also that, you know, women will think before just simply taking on their husband's surname, and think before endowing their children with their husband's surname, particularly their daughters. Yeah, I hope you're all well, and let me know what you think, and peace out, YouTube.